Hey, George, you're a scientist.
I'm a chemist, yes.
Yeah, you're a scientist. So, like a lot of people our age, I grew up watching the Animaniacs. And the Animaniacs has like a haha, isn't language interesting song about
hmm
senses. And they're like, oh, we have like a sense of hearing and a sense of sight and a sense of taste. But then the rest of the song is like all the other places in the English language we use that word, right? Like a sense of dread or a sense of wonder. And I never really thought about it before, but I don't know if it would actually be reasonable to count those things as separate or if they're like, oh no, those are all just cognition. Those don't count. Like those are all just your brain thinking. That's just you thinking. That's not the same as like the way your body perceives like taste or smell or sight. So I guess challenging the Animaniacs' wisdom, how many senses do we have?
Well, darn it, Lions. I'm a chemist, not a biologist, but with my very limited knowledge and very limited expertise, I will attempt to opine to this. So, um, first, here's something interesting. Where do you think the concept of only having five senses came from?
Oh, uh that's an interesting question. My
Right?
my very first thought there is it's probably at one of those moments in history that like every kid gets taught about and it like we someone said it and then we stopped thinking about it. So like for example, like if some famous Victorian era scientist was like, "Ah, yes, the five human senses," right? Then just that became accepted wisdom and no one ever scrutinized it again. Or if
Yep.
some religious leader 1,000 years ago was like, ah, yes, the five ways man perceives the world, and that just became accepted wisdom and we never pursued it again, right? You could go back to like maybe Aristotle or Plato talking about like the humors, right?
Mhm.
So that would be my guess is at some point, someone who got written into the history books said that whether it was flippantly or incredibly well researched for the time, and then just no one questioned it again.
You nailed it. It was Aristotle.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So to your point, right, is when you were like, oh, some Victorian era. I'm like, way older. Like somebody, your logic is correct. Somebody said the thing, and then we're all like, that sounds right. And then nobody questioned it for like 5,000 years or whatever. Like
Until the
four,
Animaniacs.
yeah, until the Animaniacs, and then they were just making fun of it, right? So I wish to depart from my prepared marks to complain about Aristotle for a minute. Um, so Aristotle, while I really like his idea of Aristotelian ethics, right? The idea that like every virtue lies between two vices. I use that all the time, especially when somebody says like, "Oh, that's not very brave." I'm like, remember, bravery lies between cowardice and stupidity. So, like when somebody's like, "Oh, I'm scared of that," I'm like, "That is good. That is a thing you should be scared of." So, good on you. They're like, "Oh, but I'm a coward." I'm like, "No, you're just have some sense of self-preservation, right? You're not stupid."
They have
Um,
a sense of self-preservation.
that's not one of them. Shut up. Anyway, so um, you're not the scientist here. Anyways, but one of the other things that he did that when I found that out, I was like, oh, that's kind of a bummer. Is that there was a one of his contemporaries whose name escapes me because that's how well we know this person, said like, hey, what if I took this piece of clay and I like cut it in half, and then I cut that in half, and then I cut that in half? There could be eventually something so small that I could no longer cut it in half, and that would be an atom. And then, which means like uncuttable, right? Like unbreakable, right? He's like, and the world is made up of these small atoms, these small building blocks that make up everything. And Aristotle said, no, dummy, it's four elements. And then we stuck with that for centuries. And that bums me out a lot, right? That like
The path not taken.
because could you imagine like if we had gone with the right thing, how much further ahead we'd be? But instead, there was just one philosopher swinging his member around who said like, no, I because you know what it was is that he was a philosopher, not a scientist, and he didn't say, darn it, other person, I'm a philosopher, not a scientist, but with my very limited knowledge and very limited expertise, I will attempt to opine to this. There was no disclaimer. He just said, I'm an expert in this too, and you're wrong. And that upsets me. So that's why we shouldn't always listen to Aristotle about stuff. So since we're not listening to Aristotle about everything, we're not taking everything Aristotle said at face value, we should examine the senses, right? So as I was going through these, you actually raised a good point where I'm like, is this really its own thing, or is this kind of a different thing, right? So how would you? So I'm going to set up a premise for an argument here. So, how would you define smell?
I would say, because we've had conversations about this before, that it is touch for chemistry, right? So
there you go. So that is also the way I would describe it.
Yeah, it is. You have receptors in our case, nostrils. I don't know if other animals have other receptors that do the same kind of chemistry, but they react with things in the air and give you information that you can then do things with.
Yes, exactly. You use information to inform decisions, which is not trivia. Correct. No, that's the way I would do it. So that's smell. What about like taste? Similar, right?
Similar, but I think kind of like we were talking about with conduction versus convection, is that taste requires contact. So like you can't.
But smell requires contact.
Taste requires direct contact with the source of the thing. Like it can't be in the fluid medium of the air.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, technically, if you were to, like, spray perfume in the air, right, and then stick out your tongue, you could probably taste it, right?
Yeah, that's fair. So I guess maybe taste is just a less. I think it's slightly less sensitive than smell, maybe a lot less sensitive, and we typically do it more like during eating, right? Like if you were trying to scent your prey out on the savannah, you would not run around with your tongue out, I don't think.
A snake would, but I would not. Yes.
Yeah. We humans wouldn't. Not any creature. I am speaking for humans. I'm not a member of any other group.
Well, but that's the thing. So whenever people are like, "Oh, well, snakes smell with their tongue," I'm like, "That's taste. They're just tasting.
They taste the air with their tongue."
Yeah, they taste. Yeah, like it's all, but it's also touch, but for chemicals, but a specific subsection, right? What about sight?
Well, sight for humans would be you have receptors, I think, in the backs of your eye, cones and rods that do like motion and color. So it's light, right? It is the way we perceive like the visible light spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Yep, it's touch, but for photons, right?
Ooh, yeah. That's good.
Yeah. So the moral of all of this, right, is that if you're saying that there are at least 5, it's all touch, right? Like you're touching something. Because a lot of these I'm going to describe that are considered, senses beyond that. You could be like, well, don't you have to be touching the thing? It's like, you got to be touching everything, So like, I just wanted to get ahead of that, right? So like, for example, if you were like, oh, well, for example, one of them is equilibrioception, a sense of balance, right? So like, like your ability to sense whether or not you're like standing upright or you're falling over to the side. And people are like, well, isn't that like a little bit informed by like your feet kind of like touching the ground? Like, okay, it's already all touch, okay, but it is its own thing. Like when you think about touching something, you're thinking about like feeling, like its texture, its shape, right? This is not that. So, like I said, I wanted to get all of those different, because when I was just like hearing people at me on social media, I'm like, look, it's like, well, that's just really touch. It's all touch, Brent. So.
Yeah. Well, and another point in there is that I don't think any creature that has multiple senses and any way to process those inputs ever does any of them in a complete silo, right?
Right.
Like the fluid in your ear that you can feel sloshing around, which is like why you feel drunk or if you get poisoned or something. Like, yes, that is a signal that tells you that your balance is messed up, but also your feet leaving the surface of the earth would also let you know you're falling down, right? And then your head crashing into the earth would let you know you're no longer standing on your feet, right? So those are all like, they're all signals that are informing your perception of the world, right? But I don't, at least for humans, I can't imagine a way you would say like, I'm focusing only on the way this tastes. And it's like, how are you not aware of like how much of the thing is in your mouth?
Right. Yeah. Like you're also touching it with your tongue. And yeah, no, I'm with you. And also, so equilibrioception, your sense of balance, I particularly enjoy, and I was describing this to my son recently, which is that equilibrioception is also one of the reasons why you get car sick, right? Because it kind of, and I believe we've probably discussed this because we've known each other for a while, but for our viewers, is like, for our viewers, number one on the AM dial, is that your the reason why you get car sick is because your equilibrium, right? Your inner ears are saying like, hey, there's a lot of motion going on, right? I'm moving around a lot, right? But when you look out of the car, everything seems pretty static, especially if you're looking at like within the car, right? Your brain is saying, your eyes are saying, no, you're not moving at all, right? You're standing still. And evolutionarily, there was, before we had cars and weird things like that and boats, there was one thing that would cause you to do that, and that's neurotoxins. So like in theory, you have ingested something that is now causing you to, according to my notes, have a bad trip. And so your body says, hey, it's time to evac the stomach muscle. And so it just crunches that down and sends it all out because it's like, I don't know what you ate, but let's just be safe and get everything out of there. So equilibrioception. Another one is, there is believed to be somewhere between 22 to 33 different senses.
And that doesn't count all the silly Animaniacs ones.
Not to my knowledge. I actually couldn't find a good place that kind of like listed all of them. So I kind of like picked and chose some of my favorites. So this is a list of my favorites. This is not a comprehensive list. But the moral of the story being is that like these should kind of get your hopefully mind jogging on like, oh, okay, that is a little bit different. Oh, I wonder if this is a different sense, that type of thing. So proprioception, which is we've discussed before, which is you knowing where your body is in relation to your body.
Oh, right. So like when you see someone who like trips over their own feet, right? Especially like a teenager going through a growth spurt because their brain literally has not realigned like, oh, your legs are longer now.
Right. Absolutely. And one of my favorite ones to test for this is I would always say to somebody when they're like, there are the 5 senses. I'm like, okay, close your eyes, right? Now touch your nose. And they do it. And they're like, how did you do that? They're like, well, I used... it's like wasn't touch, wasn't sight. I told you to close your eyes, right? And that's the one that also gets screwed up to your point when you're drunk, right? And all of a sudden your body says like, yeah, no, my nose is like in this. The error bars on your proprioception get way larger, so it's like, I know my nose is in this general area, but then all of a sudden you like swat yourself in the face, and then you go to jail. So another one is kinesthesia, which is a sense of movement.
Like awareness that you are moving or that things are moving or both or something else? I
believe it's both, right? Okay. So like you can kind of tell like when you're, like you are moving, like even if like, you're just feet on the ground, if like a boat's moving, like side to side or whatever, you're going to feel that like the boat's moving and shaking you without, and again, I was like, well, it's like, well, really, it's just my feet touching the ground that are kind of shifting with the thing. I'm like, yeah, but everything's touching, but you wouldn't consider like, yes, because I have touched the boat, I can now, like feel that it's kind of its own thing. So I thought that one was kind of cool.
That is a good one, but I do love that evolutionarily we may have selected out of having a more fine-tuned like sense there because the planet's moving real fast all the time, right? And in like axes that are very disruptive to think about from a human scale, right? It's spinning. It's also moving in an orbit. That whole system is then also orbiting the galaxy. The galaxy is moving through the universe. Could you imagine if you could feel that?
I could imagine not wanting to reproduce if I could feel all of that. So that's probably why it wasn't selected for.
Or you know what it might be? Like maybe being that in tune with like the cosmic ballet, those people just didn't want to do anything else. They just they didn't eat. They didn't want to, have intercourse and make babies. They just laid on a grassy hillside until they just wasted away.
So really, becoming enlightened like the Buddha is just really honing your sense of kinesthesia.
Someone should try it and let me know.
It's not, we have no data that refutes it.
Yeah.
And everybody knows good science is about finding data that refutes, not supports, right? So, yeah.
That's right. We're there.
Yeah, you want to prove negatives. Thermoception is another one, to know if the environment is hot or cold, right? And
this one, I didn't know that was what it was called, but I have a interesting factoid about this that you are now the exact right person to check this on. So finish what you were saying, and then we're going to find out if one of my fun facts is BS or not.
Well, this one I particularly like because I've actually spoken with people and they're like, oh, you can touch something and you can see if it's hot or cold. And I've always said, all you can do is touch something and see how quickly it is pouring energy into or taking energy out of your body. Because if your hands are cold and you touch something that's room temperature, it will feel warm, and vice versa. And that's also why, like, when you walk across tiles in a house, it feels cooler than if you walk on the carpet, even though they're both the same temperature. It's not like somehow the AC is cooling the tiles more than the carpet, right? It's just one's pulling heat out of you, and then people are like, oh, that's kind of a bummer. I'm like, it's a way more useful skill, because I don't really care if something's hot or cold. I care whether or not it's yanking my energy out of me to the point where it might become a problem.
Or pouring so much into you that it will become a problem.
Right, yeah. Like humans are made of deltas. That's all we really recognize is change. And I really need to know the rate of change of my body temperature. That's pretty important information to have. So that's thermoception. What is your question?
So the fun fact that I remember reading somewhere at some point is our skin and nerves can't really detect when something is wet, but water is a good conductor. And so what you actually detect is, oh, I have, like if you put your hand in water, because the water like conforms to your hand, that you are suddenly probably losing, unless it's very hot water, right? You are suddenly losing a tremendous amount of heat into that environment that you weren't losing into the air. So what we have actually gotten really good at is not detecting, oh, this thing is wet. It is detecting, oh, this thing is pulling a lot of energy out from me suddenly. And one of the only ways that would happen in nature is if I've gone from the air environment on land to a water environment. And the reason that, like a person in modern society might run afoul of that particular quirk is if you sit on like a metal bench and it has been in the shade and it is very cold, because metal is an excellent conductor, that it is very possible that your skin, even through like thin clothing, will feel it, and your brain will go, oh no, I've sat in water. And it's like, no, you sat on something cold.
Yes, so that is my understanding. Again, like I haven't vetted that, but that is my understanding, and it's especially because, as you mentioned, we don't tend to process this stuff in a vacuum, right? So, like, when you have made the association, because that's the thing, is that your body is pretty good at being nuanced about how much energy is being pulled out of or put into your body, right? So I believe that it's kind of like your body knows that when something is being pulled out of it at a certain rate, that like that's probably liquid, and then especially when you bring into the fact that like your body can like, notice, for example, right, is if all of a sudden I felt like, oh, there's something slightly cool on my leg, and the cool thing is slowly moving down my leg, then all of that, even if I'm not looking at it, my brain would say, oh, well, that's certainly a liquid, right? Because it's unlikely that it's some like cold insect that's just like, whatever, crawling down me, right? Yeah. But I mean, I've had that sensation myself where like I've walked by something, I'm like, oh God, was that wet? And I'm like, no, it was just cool. And I touched it briefly and it felt wet, So yes, that is my understanding. But like, again, it's the same way where like, if you color vanilla ice cream green, people will say it tastes of mint. Like we are very much so visual creatures. So the visual aspect of it definitely leans into, the feel, so absent visuals, and when you're just relying on touch or thermoception, right? Then it could make a big difference. A couple other ones I thought were kind of cool is nociception, which is your ability to feel pain, which I definitely think is kind of its own thing, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to think, like, you do often experience a bunch of other sensations when you feel pain, but we're pretty clear on what pain is, right? Like someone might say like, it's a burning, stabbing pain. And it's like, yeah, that might all be true. And maybe those are the best words we have to describe it, even if they're not true. But you would never describe sitting by a warm fire the same as being on fire.
Right. The intensity matters. And also too, like if you're, touching something, you're like, oh, it feels like a small metal thing. And then if all of a sudden you start passing electricity through that, you would say like you're not using your sense of touch to feel the pain. It's just painful, And the last one that I have that I think is interesting is chronoception, which is the sense of the passage of time.
Is wound up in that, wound up like a clock, is wound up in that like any I guess like a scale of some kind, right? Because I'm trying to think, like, there are people who get car sick really easy, right? Even though the ride is smooth and they're looking out so they can see the motion and it's more or less in line with what their body's experiencing, they still get super car sick. Or someone who can't dance, right? Because they're just like, I got two left feet. I have no idea where my feet are when I'm trying to move through space. But are there people who have like either extremely good or extremely bad chronoception, and what is that like?
Oh yeah, I mean, we ourselves can have extremely good and then extremely bad chronoception, where it's just like, oh, time flies when you're having fun, like and actually it's interesting because I feel like that we all kind of have our own kind of internal clocks for like how much time has passed. For example, at one point I was doing a task, and apparently like one of the ways I kind of mentally track, or have my chronoception keys to is like number of things that have happened, right? And so basically like an hour had passed and just everything was really quiet and chill and nothing was really going on. And I'm like, oh, it's probably been about 15 minutes. I'm like, oh no, it's been an hour because just nothing's been going on, right? So my mind didn't have anything to like key into. But yeah, I mean, like there's, and I'm sure that there are some people who have terrible chronoception and they're probably late all the time because, unless they have something external to them that they can use to set their watch to, as it were, they just completely screw it up. But yeah, so yes, I imagine that just like with all senses, unfortunately, and I would pay money for this to give somebody the equivalent of glasses for their chronoception, because that would be nice.
Right. And so you're making me think one of the biggest differences between these various senses is that your ability to do them better or worse is really wrapped up entirely in your cognition, not in the actual like instrument of measurement, right? So, for example, if you are trying to become a food critic, you might eat something and like then be told what's in it and then like train that skill and be like, oh, if I detect this kind of thing, it means they use this spice. If it has this kind of texture, it was probably cooked in this sort of way because that creates this sort of texture, right? And you could kind of train that. Or if you are like listening to music and you're trying to become like a music critic, or you're learning a language or something, like if you're an English speaker, there are whole sounds that other languages take for granted that we as English speakers don't hear. But yes, we do hear them. It's that we're not processing them in the brain part, right? But like the same sound is hitting, my ears as someone who speaks Chinese. It's just that they understand what to do with that information in a way that I don't. But like, I don't know how you would train like sight or like thermoception. Like those feel harder to imagine what like a training regiment would look like,
right?
To get like okay, every day you're gonna look at things and then do something with that.
Well, and that's interesting, especially for sight. I think that we do a lot of that. It's just that because we are sight-based creatures, we spend so much of our input is sight-based that like we everybody is training it. It's just where there are a lot more subcategories as opposed to like, oh, well, I've trained my ear to listen to music, or versus like certain animal calls or what have you, right? But like for example, if you're looking for certain types of bacterium, right? You can train your sight to look for certain things. It's like, oh, well, look for this, look for that, look for the third thing. One of the things that that they train us in Lean Six Sigma is looking for waste in a process, right? So they're like, look for transportation waste, look for, weighting waste. And so as you're scanning through it, you're like, okay, oh, well, this looks like, this is indicative, this thing looks like what it would cause if it was this other thing, So I think that that's because, though, again, like 90% of our experience is sight-based, it's just way more nuanced than that. Like in the same way that I'm sure that like you could probably way better than I could look at a string of code that's malfunctioning and say, oh, it's probably in this area, whereas I'm staring at it and being like, it's
some of these are letters to me.
Yeah. Some of these are letters, and some of them are not letters. Did I do it? Did I see?
I did it. I win.
So I think that in that case, it's a lot more a lot more narrow, the training, you know?
Well, and in general, we're all like, all of them are, you can become like a great ballet dancer, but not know how to play an instrument, even though arguably both of those things are physical skills in a certain sense, right? It's like, oh, you have to be able to, control your body and make it do what you want it to do when you want it to do it. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but getting really good at either of those things takes so much of your time and effort that you're unlikely to become great at like 50 different things, right? You could be an incredible musician and not be an incredible dancer or an incredible athlete in a particular sport. You might be a great food critic, but you have a tin ear when it comes to music. You know what I mean? Like, we have our base genetic skills, and then putting any stat points into that is like very costly.
Well, and also I think that, while we're talking about it, is that I wonder if, because, as we kind of said, like there's very few things that are, physical laws, and a lot of it's just human taxonomies and human stuff that we've just kind of ladled on top of it. So I wonder if we consider like training the ear, training your nose, training your taste, even training your eyes, to look for stuff. We consider that because we've always been told there are 5 senses, right? But with the other ones, we do train them, but we think about training a thing, and then by extension, it trains that other thing. For example, I remember when we were training in Kung Fu, there were tons of people that came in that had really poor proprioception. Because you would say, do this, and then you would do a motion, and then they'd be like this, and you're like, no, how did you think that is what I just did? Because they had no sense of where their body is in relation to themselves. Whereas if somebody came in and they said, oh, I used to dance, and then we'd say, well, then this will come very naturally to you, because we're saying like, oh, because you already have experience with moving your body. But realistically, what we're saying is you've already trained your proprioception very well. So now you're using that training over here. So I think that with a lot of these, we consider the task, and then because we don't consider these senses, we don't think of it as training that sense, but that's actually what's happening.
Yeah, and a person would probably get to deeper levels of whatever thing they're trying to train up if they maybe thought about it in that broader way, right? Like, oh, you're not just learning how to, taste food. You're learning how to like listen to the signals your body gives you, right? And like,
yes,
all of the man, I'm going to go lay on a hillside and just become one with the universe. And then I'll think of another question I wanted to ask you.